Everybody inside. Now, move. 23 riders in black leather sit frozen on their machines, staring down a skinny 16-year-old kid who's standing in an open garage doorway, waving both arms like the world is ending. And in a way, it is. The sky above him has curdled into the color of a fresh bruise. The air tastes like a struck match and wet metal. Then the first chunk of ice, the size of a golf ball, punches clean through a windshield on the front bike. That's the exact moment Silas Vandal Thorne, the man who leads one of the most notorious motorcycle brotherhoods in the country, does the one thing nobody in that convoy expected him to do. He trusts the kid. Stick around for this one, because before it's over, you'll be reminded that bravery doesn't check your ID, and generosity doesn't ask permission. The town of Millhaven, Nebraska never asked to matter to anyone. It just sat there on the flat, endless stomach of the plains, like a place somebody had put down for a second and forgot to come back for. Two traffic lights, one diner, a post office that locked its doors early every Friday, and a hush that dropped over the whole town by 8 each night, thick as a second sky. It was the sort of town where your neighbors knew your business before you'd fully worked it out yourself, where anything the least bit strange got spotted, whispered about, and tucked away for a later before the sun even finished setting. Nobody paid much mind anymore to the old Blake place. It sat at the dead end of Grover Street, half hidden behind a line of tired elms that shed limbs in every stiff wind. What you'd see, if you happened to glance that way, was a house doing its level best to hold itself together, paint curling off the window frames, a porch that tilted a little to one side like it had simply grown weary of standing up straight, and a garden that had once been lovely and now survived purely on memory and grit. Behind the house, joined by a path of cracked concrete, stood a garage. That garage was where Ethan Blake actually lived. He was 16 that summer, his mother's deep blue eyes, and from the father who'd vanished, a gift for silence, not the uneasy kind of quiet that signals trouble. Ethan's stillness was the quiet of a mind that was always 3 steps down the road from wherever his hands currently were, so locked into whatever problem sat in front of him that speech simply became beside the point. His teachers wrote him off as distant. Kids at school called him strange. His mother called him her miracle, usually in that hushed half-voice mothers use when they're saying something too tender to say out loud. If you wanted to describe what Ethan actually was, the word was mechanical, not in the cold, robotic sense people sometimes mean, but the way you'd call someone musical. It ran through him so completely that pulling it apart from the rest of him would have been impossible. He read engines the way other people read sentences, the way a poet catches rhythm in ordinary talk that everyone else just hears as noise. He could stand and listen to a motor idling and name what was wrong with it before he touched a single tool. He could put his hand on a transmission and feel information the way a nurse reads a pulse. Data with no visible shape, processed through some sense that didn't have a proper name. At 9, he'd taken apart his very first small engine, a busted lawnmower his mother had dragged home from a yard sale, the seller cheerfully warning her it was probably scrap. Ethan had laid every piece out across the garage floor, studied each one in patient silence, and reassembled the whole machine correctly on the first try. It ran better than it had the day it left the factory. From then on, the garage was his kingdom. He kept it spotless in that particular way of someone who understands order is really a form of thought, tools racked just so, every surface wiped down, the concrete floor swept, so often it had a dull shine to it. Afternoons and weekends, he took in odd repair jobs from around the neighborhood. People who'd learned the Blake boy could fix nearly anything for next to nothing, because the little money he earned went straight to his mother, and the work itself fed something in him that no paycheck ever could. Lawnmowers, tillers, the occasional small bike, and every so often somebody would wheel in an old, complicated car, and he'd disappear into it with the calm of someone doing exactly what he was built for. His mother, Sarah Blake, watched all this with a love so enormous it sometimes scared her. 38 years old, she carried herself like a woman who'd been running on fumes for a long stretch, because that's precisely what she was. 4 days a week, sometimes 5, she cleaned houses on the wealthier side of town. Big places owned by people who weren't cruel. Exactly, just rarely warm. And she spent her days making other people's lives look effortless. She took real pride in doing that work well, and she guarded that pride carefully, because it was one of the only things nobody could take from her. The house wasn't theirs. That fact sat at the center of Sarah's life like a stone in her shoe, never crushing, but never absent either, especially on the first of every month. When the rent came due, and she'd run the same numbers and land on the same tight, breathless answer, they were surviving month to month with no cushion, no room for anything going sideways. She'd been doing that math for 3 years, ever since Ethan's father drifted off, not in some dramatic blow-up, but the slow way people simply evaporate, showing up less and less, until one day you realize he hasn't really been there in a long while, and the empty space has quietly become the new ordinary. Money came from him sometimes, rarely on schedule, never enough. Their landlord went by Gerald Henderson. In a different telling of this story, he might have stayed background scenery, the stock difficult landlord, adding a little texture and nothing more. In the Blake story, he was something else entirely. 54 years old, driving a white pickup that always gleamed in a way that felt intentional, with a smile that showed up a beat too fast and lingered a beat too long, like something being managed rather than felt. He owned 11 rental houses around Millhaven, and he'd spent decades perfecting a system that looked, from any outside angle, perfectly legitimate. What it actually was, underneath, was a slow-motion squeeze. He rented to people with nowhere else to turn, single mothers, retirees stretching fixed incomes, young families just getting their footing. And then, gradually, he manufactured trouble. Nothing loud, nothing that would draw eyes. A repair request logged but never finished. A payment entered wrong in his books. A clause tucked into paragraph 14 of the lease that quietly meant something different from what had been promised out loud. He was a patient man. He'd learned that people under enough financial strain will swallow an astonishing amount of grief before they push back, and by the time they finally decide to fight, he's already stacked the deck so the fight is nearly unwinnable. With Sarah, he'd been 8 months into the process. He started by misfiling to payments she'd made on time, logging them as late, quietly building a paper trail that painted her as unreliable when she wasn't. Then came a letter, dressed up in careful legal phrasing, noting that her lease included language about consistent, timely payment, and that further trouble might force a review of her tenancy. Sarah read that letter 3 times, her hands going cold, then drove to the bank and pulled statements proving every payment had landed on time. She brought them to Henderson, who studied them with an expression of gentle, patient sympathy and floated the idea that maybe it was a processing hiccup. These things happen. Surely they could sort it out together. They never sorted it out. The error stayed right there in his ledger. A second letter arrived, then a third, each one a shade more formal, a shade closer to final, all of them somehow implying an ending was coming even while pretending to offer a choice. Ethan knew all of it. His mother tried to keep it from him. She was built to shield, instinct pulling every hard thing toward herself and away from him. But Ethan noticed things the way quiet people so often do, because they aren't burning energy talking. He'd seen the letters lying on the kitchen table. He'd watched his mother's face while she read them. He'd overheard her on late-night calls, using that carefully flattened voice she used whenever she was scared and didn't want it to show. Asking questions he could tell, from the shape of them, were about lawyers, about rights, about exactly what Henderson could and couldn't legally do. What Ethan felt about all this wasn't easy to name. Not panic. He simply wasn't wired for panic. Not helplessness either, though helplessness would have made sense. He was 16, broke, without any of the ordinary levers of power. What he carried instead was something more like focused anger, the specific frustration of a person who can see a broken system clean as day, who understands exactly where it's being twisted, but doesn't yet have the tool to fix it. He thought about Henderson's ledger the way he thought about a coughing engine. A problem with a solution somewhere he just hadn't located yet. That was where his mind still was. The afternoon, the sky started changing. He was in the garage, elbow deep in an old Honda generator that belonged to Mr. Paulson down the road, a retired electrician, hard of hearing, endlessly kind. Fuel delivery trouble, nothing complicated. He'd diagnosed it inside 5 minutes and was working the carburetor clean, hands moving on autopilot, while part of his brain kept circling the Henderson problem he couldn't quite shut off. A country station murmured low on the workbench radio. The first thing that caught him was the light. It shifted in a way that was hard to put into words, not simply darker, but different, like something essential had been drained out of it. He looked up through the open garage door and saw the southwestern sky had turned a color he'd never seen before, a sick greenish gray that had nothing to do with an ordinary summer storm. This was the sky getting ready to do something violent. He set his tools down, walked to the open doorway, and the hair on his arms stood straight up. The air had gone thick and charged. That pressure cooker feeling that comes right before something breaks loose, and underneath it, faint at first. He caught a sound resolving out of static into something with shape, like gravel being flung at a tin roof, growing louder by the second. He grabbed his phone. He was on the weather app before he'd even decided to check it, and what he saw made his stomach drop straight through the floor. A severe thunderstorm warning, issued 11 minutes earlier, already active for the whole county, and buried in red text, a word he'd only ever known as an abstraction, now pointed straight at him. Large hail, golf ball-sized, possibly softball-sized at the core, moving northeast at 52 miles an hour. He didn't need a calculator. The storm sat 8 miles southwest on the radar, and 8 miles at 52 an hour meant it would be on top of them in under 10 minutes. That's when he heard them. He heard them before he ever laid eyes on them. A deep, rolling stack of engine noise. The kind you feel in your ribs before your brain even registers it as sound. The sort of presence that changes the acoustic character of an entire block just by existing on the same stretch of road. He stepped outside and looked south toward Highway 77. And there they were, rounding the long bend where Grover Street met the county road. A line of motorcycles that just kept coming, riding two abreast, both lanes claimed with the easy confidence of a group used to owning whatever pavement they touched. He started counting. Past 15. Kept going. Big machines, mostly Hollies, clearly maintained with real care by people who took them seriously. The riders wore leather vests over long sleeves, some helmeted, some not, and as they closed the distance he made out the patch stitched across their backs, recognizable even here, even to a boy who spent more time in a garage than in front of a news feed. He had about 7 seconds to decide. The hail beat him to it. The first stone slammed into the driveway 5 feet to his left with a crack like a gunshot. Then another hit the garage roof, and suddenly they were falling everywhere at once, no pattern to it, each one landing with the violence of something that had dropped a long way and picked up everything the fall had to offer. The bikes were still 200 yards out. He watched riders ducking, swerving. Something sharp and distant cracked, maybe a windshield. Someone shouted words lost in the building roar. He bolted back inside, flipped the overhead lights, and stood in the space he'd measured 1,000 times in his head. He knew every inch of it, every obstacle, every possible configuration. His mind ran the geometry fast. The generator on the bench, the shelving along the back wall, his mother's car parked to the left. He hauled the generator, heavy and awkward, into the back corner, and wedged it beneath the lowest shelf, then swept everything else off the middle of the floor and shoved it to the sides, clearing a lane, running the width in his head, arriving at a number. He turned and sprinted back toward the door. The convoy had bogged down out front. Riders scrambled to kick their stands down, hunching their own bodies over their bikes, as if that would do anything against stones that size. One man sat dead still at the front of the pack, bigger than the rest, older, holding a stillness in the middle of all that chaos that only comes from someone very used to pressure, clearly running calculations of his own. Ethan made the only call that made sense to him, and started waving. Hey, get in here. All of you, into the garage, now. His voice cracked halfway through, and he didn't care. Nobody moved. Of course nobody moved. He was a scrawny teenager standing in a doorway, and they were riders in a brotherhood that had existed since 1948. And that's not a gap most instincts cross easily. A stone punched a dent the size of a coin into a bike parked near the curb. "Your bikes," he shouted, and something in his tone shifted. Not begging now, reporting. Passing along information that mattered and needed to land. "They're getting wrecked right now. I've got room. Get them in here." The lead rider hadn't moved a muscle. He studied Ethan across the gap, an expression Ethan couldn't fully read through the hail and the strange light. Then the man put two fingers to his lips and let out a whistle sharp enough to cut through the storm, followed it with a single rolling wave of his hand, and the whole line surged forward. Ethan cleared the doorway. The first 3 bikes rolled in fast, riders who clearly knew how to handle a big machine in tight quarters, and Ethan was right there beside them talking, not shouting, just clear and quick, because the garage was already loud with hail hammering the roof and engine noise, and raising his voice past a point would only make it harder to hear. "Left wall. Angle it about 45. You'll fit more that way. Yes, just like that. Next, pull up tight. Leave 6 inches between you. You'll feel it." The lead rider had already killed his engine and pulled his helmet, watching Ethan with an expression sliding, second by second, from blank to genuinely alert. He was a big man, not tall, but built wide through the shoulders, the way decades of physical labor build a person, carrying that weight in his upper body, and in the way he simply stood. His face had the deep creases of a man who'd spent an enormous amount of his life outdoors, a pale old scar tracking along his jaw, faded silver with age, grey hair cropped short, and his eyes, under the garage lights, were a striking grey-blue, doing something very active, reading the room, reading Ethan, reading the whole space, at a speed that didn't match how still the rest of him held. He watched Ethan guide the next 6 riders in, with the same economical focus, not bossy, not rattled, not performing authority, just genuinely exercising it, because he knew this space and they didn't, and that made the authority real. He watched him redirect to riders who'd come in at the wrong angle, watched him do fresh math on the fly and adjust, watched a teenager orchestrate 23 motorcycles into a space that had no business holding them, and somehow was holding them, because the kid had run numbers none of them had thought to run. "Last 2. Ethan called, already back near the door. "Straight in, then hard left. There, stop." He put one palm up. Both riders stopped. Perfect. He hit the wall switch, and the garage door rolled down. The hail's roar, which had been climbing towards something overwhelming, dropped into something contained, still violent, still present, but muffled through walls and roof into a sound you could stand inside of. The lights held. The floor held. 23 motorcycles stood packed into that garage, and a pattern Ethan had built inside his own head in 3 minutes, not one touching another. 23 men stood among them, looking around at each other, at Ethan, at the ceiling as a hailstone, the size of a lemon, slammed the roof, and the whole structure shuddered once. The big man with the grey-blue eyes crossed to where Ethan stood and stopped a feet away, looking down at him with an expression that had settled into something neither one thing nor its opposite. "That garage was mine for about 90 seconds, he said. Ethan blinked. "Sir, the way you ran that, like you'd done it your whole life." A pause. "How old are you?" 16. He studied Ethan another moment. "Silas Thorne. People call me Vandal." "Ethan Blake." No hesitation. "This is my garage. My mom owns it. We live here." Something shifted in Vandal's face. Small, precise, like an instrument being recalibrated. "That call you made just saved us a world of pain," he said. "Hail like that eats bikes alive. Some of these wouldn't have come back from it." Another pause. "Why'd you do it? You didn't know a thing about us." Ethan gave the question the seriousness it deserved. "You were about to get hurt. Your bikes were about to get wrecked. I had room." He shrugged. An honest, 16-year-old shrug. It was the obvious move. Vandal held his gaze a long beat. Outside, something heavy, a branch, probably, slammed into the garage wall, and a couple of the men near the door flinched back a step. The wall held. Obvious, Vandal repeated, and something warmer flickered across his face. Not everybody sees it that way. Toward the back, two of the younger riders were studying how the bikes had been packed with the specific attention of people who understand machinery and recognize good work when they see it. One of them, dark-haired, maybe 25, a full sleeve of ink down one arm, crouched to check the angle and the gap. "How'd you know they'd all fit?" he asked, standing. "You didn't measure a thing." "I know this garage," Ethan said. "Been working in it 6 years." He glanced along the row. And honestly, the math wasn't that hard. 23 bikes. Average handlebar width around 32 inches. You lose a little to the angling, but the diagonal pattern earns it back. He caught himself. "Sorry, I just mean it worked out." The tattooed rider glanced at the broad blonde man beside him, who was listening with the look of someone stumbling onto something unexpected. That man glanced at Vandal, and Vandal, watching Ethan with an expression that had clearly moved past neutral by now, asked, "What do you actually do in this garage?" "Besides rescue motorcycles, repairs, mostly, small engines, some cars." He nodded at the half-stripped generator on the bench. "I was cleaning a carburetor when the storm hit. I take jobs from around the neighborhood." "You work alone?" "Yeah, my mom's at work." Something flickered across Ethan's face at that. Small, barely there, the shadow of something bigger passing quickly and vanishing. Vandal caught it. 30 years of reading rooms had taught him to notice the things other people decided weren't worth noticing. He said nothing about it. Not yet. Instead, he turned to face his men, 23 of them packed into that small garage. Some sitting on their bikes, some braced against the walls, some standing wedged in the narrow gaps between machines with the patient discomfort of big men in a small space. They were quiet, not restrained quiet, but the settling quiet of people who'd just come through something fast and were still catching up to it. "Boys," Vandal said, his voice carrying easily without needing to rise. "This is Ethan. His garage just saved every one of your bikes from looking like somebody took a hammer to them." He let that sit a beat. "What do you say?" What came back surprised Ethan. Not the words themselves, just a chorus of thanks in different shapes, but the weight underneath them, the genuine unity of it. Arriving from the whole room at once, our away groups don't usually manage, unless they mean it. His face went warm. He looked at his shoes a second, then made himself look back up, because he wasn't going to be embarrassed in his own garage. Outside, the hail hit a new peak, the roof singing under it. Not damage, he didn't think, just relentless drumming filling every corner of the space. A few men glanced up on instinct. One of them, older, maybe 60, full white beard, hands like weathered stone, shut his eyes a moment, opened them again, and murmured to no one in particular, "Lord have mercy." Ethan looked over the locked wheels, the tight little gaps between machines, weighed whether anyone might need a fast way out, considered repositioning the two bikes nearest the door, decided against it. The storm was still too fierce. Stability mattered more than speed right now. "There's water in the back," he said, because hospitality was simply what you offered guests, whoever they happened to be, and chairs, if anyone wants to sit. He nodded toward a stool and to folding chairs on the wall. "Not much, but we're fine, kid," said a heavy-set, bald rider with a beard the color of rust reaching down to his chest. His voice sounded rough, by years of wind, or cigarettes or both. "We've stood in worse." "What's wrong with the carburetor?" asked the tattooed rider, drifting toward the bench, genuinely curious. "Main jet's partly clogged, fuel running lean, engine hunting under load." Ethan moved to the bench without thinking. The way you move toward something that's simply yours, lifting the carburetor body to show the tiny channel along its base. Right there, something got into the fuel, probably water sitting a while. "You can see where it's been choked off." The man leaned in. "You caught that just from listening." It missed under load in a pattern, not random, not ignition trouble, had a rhythm to it. Lean miss sounds different from rich miss, different again from a timing issue. Once you hear it once, it's hard to miss. He set the part down. You can feel it too. If you hold your hand near the exhaust, the man straightened, looking at him with something direct and appraising and not unfriendly. Gunnison, he said, offering a hand. Rex Gunnison. Ethan shook it. You ride a Heritage Softail, he added, without even glancing at the bikes. Or you used to, where you looked at that carburetor, where you were reading the engine angle. Softail riders hold their heads a certain way when they're thinking bottom end. Gunnison blinked, then let out a short, surprised laugh. 98. 112,000 miles on that engine. How's the primary chain? Getting loose. You'll feel it in the clutch pull when it's cold. Get stiffer before it settles. Gunnison studied him another beat, then glanced at Vandal. This kid, he said, it didn't need finishing. Outside. The hail had gone from noise into something closer to geology, reshaping surfaces, leaving marks that would still be there by morning. Ethan thought about the road out front, pitted, puddling fast in every low spot. A scene that would take minutes to make and weeks to forget. He thought about the bikes that had been caught outside those first 15 seconds, the ones that hadn't made it in fast enough, and what he hadn't managed to save. You okay? Vandal was watching him, thinking about the bikes still out there before we got everyone in. Did they take damage? Wicker's fender picked up a dent, Vandal said, tipping his head toward a lean, red-haired rider off in the corner inspecting his front fender with the resigned look of a man assessing something he can live with. Ruiz cracked a corner of his fairing. He paused. It's not nothing, but it's not what would have happened if we'd sat out there 5 more minutes. And you know that? Yeah, Ethan said, looking at his hands. I know. Then quit apologizing for what you saved and start letting yourself have saved it. Something in the flat clarity of that, the simple, uncomplicated line Vandal drew between cause and effect, settled something in Ethan he hadn't realized was still unsettled. He looked at the man a moment, then gave a single nod, the kind you give when you're taking in something you know is true. Okay, he said. The hail hit its peak and stayed there. Several riders pulled out phones, checking radar with the focused attention of people who find comfort in information. A young one, barely 22 by the look of him, said, "There's another band behind this one. We're gonna be here a while." "Tell me something I don't know," muttered the old man with the white beard. Ethan crossed to the back wall, pulled down the folding chairs, opened them in the cleared space behind the last row of bikes, then looked at the stall, looked at the old man, and carried it over. "Sir," he said, setting it down. The old man studied him, the way people who've lived a long time sometimes study the young, not condescending, measuring, comparing him against a long private archive. "Name's Doyle," he said, easing himself onto the stool with the careful movements of joints that had opinions. "Dale Doyle. Everyone just calls me Doyle. Ethan Blake. Heard you the first time." He looked around the garage, tools, order, the half-built generator. "You do all this yourself?" "Yes, sir." 16, you said. Doyle made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He nodded at the generator. "What's wrong with it?" "Carburetor. Partly blocked jets. You get it fixed." "Almost." Storm interrupted. "Whose is it?" "Neighbors in Mr. Paulson, down the block. 73. Lives alone. Uses it as backup when the power drops." Ethan glanced at it. "He's been without it a week. I want to get it back to him tonight." Doyle held his eyes a long moment. "Tonight," he echoed. "If this storm clears by dark." He nodded at the roof, still arguing with the hail. "Might not. You worried about the old man?" Ethan thought about it. "He's fine," he said. "It's not supposed to get cold tonight, but he worries anyway." He picked up a shop rag and folded it precisely in half, then in half again. A habit. "He's already apologized 3 times for the delay. I don't want him worrying more than he has to." Doyle said nothing for a moment, looked at his boots, then said, "You're a good kid. Don't argue with it. Just take it." Doyle looked up, brown eyes steady and direct. "When a man tells you you're decent, You say thank you and mean it. Thank you, Ethan said, and meant it. Vandal had drifted down the row, checking each bike with the practiced hand of someone who'd spent decades responsible for other people's machines. A palm across a tank, a crouch to check a wheel gap, a quiet word to Wicker about the fender, another to Ruiz about the crack. He moved without wasted motion, and Ethan tracked him without appearing to. The way he tracked everything. When Vandal straightened and turned, Ethan seemed to be studying the wall, thinking about something else, but Vandal had the sense that looking away wasn't the same as not paying attention. You know who we are, Vandal said. Not a question. Hell's Angels, Ethan said, still half facing the wall before turning. MC, bother you? Ethan weighed the question honestly. No, why not? You got caught in a dangerous storm and needed somewhere to be. I had somewhere. He tipped his head toward the closed door, the world beyond it. The patch doesn't change that. Being in my garage, because it was the right call. That's not the same as whatever's happening out there. Vandal studied him. Most people wouldn't draw that line. Most people aren't paying close enough attention. Something crossed Vandal's face harder to name than anything before it. There and gone in a second. Where's your dad? The bluntness of it caught Ethan off guard enough that he answered before deciding to. Gone. How long? 3 years. Vandal nodded once, an acknowledgement that didn't demand more. That recognized the shape of a thing without needing its details. Just you and your mom. Yes, sir. And this garage. And this garage, outside. The Hales character shifted, still loud, but the violence had softened into a harder, steadier rain. The kind that signals the worst has already passed, and what's left is cleanup. Several of the men relaxed without noticing they were doing it. Small shifts in posture. The body's quiet version of exhaling. It's moving off, said the young rider watching his phone. Second band's tracking east of us. Rain, but no more hail. How long till it's safe to ride? Wicker asked, still distracted by his fender. Hour, maybe a bit more. Ethan glanced at the door control, at the men, at the bikes. An hour, at least. He thought through what that meant, what he could offer. Then walked to the interior door connecting to the house, knocked on the frame out of old habit, though nobody was home to answer, and turned back. Bathrooms through there if anybody needs it, he said. Appreciated, came from several directions at once. I've got tools if anyone wants that fender or the fairing looked at. No body filler, but I've got a paintless dent kit. I could probably pull most of that dent back out. Wicker, if you want. The red-haired rider looked up sharply. You can do that. Done it before. No promises, but he glanced at the fender. That's a pressure dent, not a crease. Good odds it comes back clean. Wicker looked to Vandal. Vandal looked to Ethan. Kid offers to fix your bike, Vandal said. You say yes, yes, Wicker said immediately. Ethan pulled the dent repair kit from a lower cabinet. Rods, tabs, a small slide hammer, all rolled neatly in canvas. He'd bought it used a year back, spent 3 weeks practicing on salvage panels before trusting himself to touch anything that mattered. He crouched at Wicker's bike, examined the dent from below, from the side, ran his fingertips over the surface, pressing lightly at the edges to feel how far the damage reached. He tilted his head. This'll take about 15 minutes, he said. And I need you not to watch. It's harder to work with somebody hovering. Wicker laughed, surprised into it, genuine. Deal. Ethan sat and got to work. The garage had taken on something hard to define, but easy to feel, somewhere between a shelter and a sanctuary. That strange closeness a shared space can build when the outside world's violence creates an inside world's odd intimacy. Men who'd ridden together 4 years, who knew each other the way people do after going through things side by side, found themselves in unfamiliar closeness with each other and with this boy. His tools, his order, the rain a steady undertone beneath everything. Nobody in any hurry now. Doyle found an old, worn repair manual on the shelf above the bench, cracked spine, pencil notes crowding the margins, and opened it like a familiar language. Gunnison had pulled up a plastic crate near Ethan's workspace, watching despite being told not to. Watching at an angle meant to suggest he wasn't, Ethan noticed, and let it slide, because curiosity wasn't the same as crowding. Vandal stood near the interior door, not quite sitting, not quite standing, eyes making a slow circuit of the room, watching Ethan work the dent tool with a focus that wasn't performed, just the natural stillness of a man watching something worth watching. 11 minutes in, Ethan sat back, checked the angle, stood, and said, "Come look." Wicker crouched where he pointed, looked a long moment. The dent was gone, not softened, not improved, gone. The panel's curve restored, so completely you'd never know anything had ever marked it. "How?" Wicker said. "Not really a question. Pressure and patience," Ethan said. "Same as most things." Wicker stood, looked at him with plain and calculated respect, and put out a hand. Ethan shook it. Vandal watched the exchange without expression, then looked up at the roof, where rain kept its steady rhythm, where hail had done its work and moved on, where the sky at the edges was starting, very slowly, to consider light again. He thought about a 16-year-old who'd counted motorcycles from a doorway, run geometry in his head, and made a call in 3 seconds that most grown men would have spent 10 minutes deliberating and still not made. He thought about the way the kid moved through his own space. No swagger, no performance, just quiet certainty from someone who knew exactly what he knew. He thought about the flicker that had crossed his face at the mention of his mother, and the single word he'd used. Asterisk gone. Asterisk the rain held for another 40 minutes, and in that stretch the garage became something none of them had a name for yet. Gunnison had stopped pretending not to watch and rolled his crate close enough to ask questions without shouting, and Ethan answered each one with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. Not showing off, just handing knowledge over the way you give away something you have plenty of. The carburetor was clean now, jets clear, float set right, reassembled with a precision Gunnison, 22 years wrenching on his own bikes, recognized as better than competent. "Who taught you all this?" he asked. Ethan set his wrench down, thought it over honestly. "Books, mostly. YouTube when I had internet. Trial and error." He picked the wrench back up, turned it once. "There's a guy down the street, Mr. Paulson, used to let me watch him work his old tractor. He's the one who taught me to listen to an engine instead of just looking at it." "The generator guy?" "Yeah." Gunnison eyed the reassembled machine. "You gonna test fire it?" "Not in here, too loud. I'll run it outside once the rain lets up." He glanced at the door. "Don't want to spook anybody with a startup. A rider named Torres, compact, dark-eyed, quick, energy like he was always half a step ahead of the moment. Didn't even look up from his phone. Kid, we ride Hollies. Nothing a generator does is gonna spook us." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. The loose kind that happens once people stop being strangers and haven't yet decided what they are instead. Ethan felt the temperature of the room shifting, aware something was happening he didn't have precise words for. 23 people and one teenager, trapped together by weather, proximity dissolving in an hour what usually takes years. Vandal had settled onto an overturned milk crate against the far wall, forearms on his knees, grey-blue eyes making their slow, patient circuit, watching his men, watching Ethan, watching the small social shifts happening in real time. Who'd relaxed, who was still holding something back, who was talking, who was listening. Doyle, still on the workbench stool, had set the manual aside and fallen into a low conversation with a rider named Cass, 23 or so, broad-shouldered, still growing into himself, something Ethan couldn't quite hear. But Cass was listening with his whole attention, phone forgotten, body angled toward the old man like someone receiving what they need. Wicker crouched near his bike, running a hand over the spot where the dent used to be. The way you touch something at great belief. Every few minutes he glanced at Ethan with an expression still working out what to do with itself. Ethan absorbed all of it peripherally, without cataloging, the way a room absorbs sound, while his hands stayed with the work in front of him, seating the generator's final casing screws to exactly the right torque, not stripped, not loose, right. That was when the interior door swung open, not the garage door, the one to the house, the one he'd pointed to earlier as the way to the bathroom. It flew open fast, pushed by someone who hadn't expected to walk into 23 leather-clad strangers, and Sarah Blake came 3 steps in before stopping dead. She stopped so completely her forward momentum seemed to reverse itself, pulled back by whatever her eyes were registering. Still in her work clothes, dark slacks, plain top, hair a little damp from the run from the car, keys still in her fist. 38 years old. Not a woman who scared easily. She'd learned over 3 years that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. But what she was looking at was 24 large men crowding a small space, most in Hell's Angels patches, all of them now looking back at her. And the fact that her son stood among them was registering, but slowly, not fast enough to stop the cold wave that dropped from her stomach into her throat. Ethan, her voice held steady, forced steady, and you could hear the effort if you listened. Mom, he was already crossing to her. Not running, the specific pace of someone who needs to get there fast without letting it look like something was wrong. Because the first thing she needed to receive was that nothing was. It's okay. They got caught in the storm. I let them in. She looked at him, at the men, at the bikes, packed in tight, precise rows that filled her garage like something out of a dream that hadn't decided yet if it was good or bad. You let them in, she said. And there was a whole world folded into that sentence. Hail was golf ball size, he said. Same tone he'd used with Vandal, plain, clear, stating the obvious. Their bikes would have been destroyed. I had room. She still had her keys clenched in one hand, reading her son's face with the desperate focus of a mother trying to gauge, in real time, whether fear was the right response, whether he was truly fine or just performing fine for her sake. Vandal stood. He crossed the room with deliberate, unhurried, entirely legible movement, stopped 6 feet from her, far enough to give her room, close enough to be heard, and held one hand slightly away from his body. An old gesture, older than he was. The universal language of asterisk I mean you no harm. Asterisk mum, he said. Silas Thorne. I'm genuinely sorry to be standing in your home without your say-so. Your son made a call I don't think most grown men would have made. He saw 23 people about to take a beating from this storm, and he opened his door for us. We're only here because he decided we should be, and we're grateful for it. A pause. Soon as this rain lets up enough to ride, we'll clear out. Sarah studied him the way Ethan studied engines, not the surface glance most people give, but the deeper kind that comes from needing to be right about people when being wrong costs something. She read his stillness, the directness of his eyes, the careful position of his hands. She read the room around him. 23 men who'd all, without a word passed between them, eased back slightly, given her space, arranged themselves less like they were taking up room, and more like they were making sure to crowd a woman who just walked into something she never saw coming. She took one full breath, the keys in her hand stilled. Is anyone hurt? No, ma'am. Are the bikes okay? Something flickered across Vandal's face. Not quite surprise. Close cousin to it. Couple minor dents. Your son already fixed one. Sarah looked at Ethan, a complicated look. Part exhaustion, part pride, part relief. Fear still simmering underneath. Not yet resolved. Just managed. Of course he did, she said. And her voice lost its forced steadiness. Just her own voice again. Warmer than the careful version had been. Mom, you okay? I'm fine. She scanned the room again. Fuller this time. Now that shock had settled enough to actually let her see. Doyle on the stool, giving her a nod full of quiet respect. Cass, younger looking than she'd have guessed. Not unlike some kid from Ethan's school. Torres, phone away now. Watching her with the care of someone who understood this moment needed handling right. Wicker, near his bike, who caught her eye and said quietly, your son fixed something I figured needed a body shop. Wanted you to know that. Sarah didn't cry. She wasn't a person who cried. Not right now. But something crossed her face that lived in the same neighborhood as crying. The look of someone right at the edge of a decision not to. Is there, she started, stopped, restarted. Hospitality, ingrained deep, the oldest reflex she had, surfacing through the shock like something that had been held underwater and finally broke the surface. Is there anything you need? I could make coffee. I've got. She was already running her kitchen inventory in her head. I've got food if anyone's hungry. It's not much, but, ma'am, Vandal said gently, you don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, she said. Something in it not quite sharp, not quite warm, but entirely genuine. I'm offering. He studied her a moment. Then coffee would be appreciated. Thank you. She gave one nod, turned, and went back through the door. In her absence, the garage settled into a quiet that felt different, fuller somehow, like the whole room had just taken a breath. Doyle said, to no one in particular. That is a good woman. Nobody argued. Ethan stood a moment, looking at the door she'd disappeared through, running the private math of a teenager who loves his mother and also happens to be 16 and carries complicated feelings about everything love asks of him. Then he turned back to the generator, because the work was still there and the work was the language he spoke best. A few minutes later, Gunnison asked, you good, kid? Yad a beat. She worries. Mothers do. She's got more to worrying about than most people. He said it flatly, without any of the performed weariness teenagers sometimes reach for when they want adults to know they get it. Just a fact, stated as a fact. Gunnison looked at him. What's she worried about? Ethan's hands slowed on the casing. He glanced at the interior door. He hadn't planned to say any of this, hadn't consciously decided to. Maybe the storm had something to do with it, that strange inside-outside closeness it had built, the way 23 strangers had become, in the span of an hour, something less than strangers, something he didn't have a word for. Our landlord, he said. He's been trying to push us out for 8 months. Fake records, fake late payments. His jaw tightened. He wants the property, the garage especially, I think. He's got a whole development plan going, already bought up 4 other places on this block. He looked at Gunnison. He's made every step of it look legal. My mum went to a lawyer who told her it'd cost more to fight it than to just move. The garage went quieter without ever going silent. The kind of shift that happens when several people, without announcing it, start paying closer attention. She's got proof? Vandal asked. His voice was the same level, measured tone as always, carrying without being raised, but he'd moved closer. Ethan looked at him. She's got bank statements, showing every single payment on time. He's got a ledger that says otherwise. An edge crept into his voice, the same focused anger that had been living in him since the first letter. He's had 20 years of practice. My mom's one person making $41,000 a year. Vandal said nothing for a moment. His eyes drifted around the room, a slow, deliberate sweep, landing briefly on 3 or 4 of his men in a sequence that wasn't random. Ethan noticed the pattern, just not yet what it meant. What's his name? Torres asked from across the room, casual in the specific way that some questions are casual on purpose. Henderson, Ethan said. Gerald Henderson. Why? Just asking, Torres said, and went back to his phone. Gunnison settled back onto his crate with the look of a man filing something away for later. Doyle straightened on his stool, brown eyes tracking between Ethan and Vandal with the alert focus of someone watching a story unfold in real time. Cass had gone very still. The interior door opened again, and Sarah came back in balancing a loaded tray, mugs, a full pot of coffee, a plate of something quickly assembled, sandwiches or rolls, whatever she'd had on hand. She carried it with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years balancing trays, eyes already scanning for somewhere to set it down. Ethan crossed to her immediately, took the tray, cleared a spot on the bench. She didn't argue, just followed and began handing out mugs with the calm efficiency of someone who defaults to hospitality whenever nothing else feels solid, who'd learned that feeding people was its own kind of order in situations that resisted every other kind. The men took the mugs and said, "Thank you," not the reflexive kind, but the weighted kind, the thank you of people caught off guard by generosity and responding honestly to the surprise of it. Sarah nodded to each in turn, and when she reached Doyle, she paused, because he was studying her with the same long, archival look he'd given Ethan earlier. "Your boy's something special, ma'am," Doyle said. "I've ridden with a lot of people, worked alongside a lot of men in my time, never seen anybody read a room the way he read this garage. Never seen a 16-year-old make the call he made today." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "He's got a gift." Sarah looked across the bench at her son, very deliberately not appearing to be listening. "I know," she said quietly. "You're raising him right. I'm raising him the best I know how," she said. No false modesty in it, no bravado either, just the plain truth of an effort still very much in progress. Doyle nodded. Same thing. Vandal had been watching that exchange from near the wall, his mug warming his hands, coffee untouched. Now he glanced at Torres again, the same look as before, and Torres gave one barely visible nod, put his phone to his ear, and threaded his way toward the back of the garage, voice dropping below the room's noise. Ethan clocked it, filed it, unsure yet what to do with it. 20 minutes on, the rain had softened from a roar to a murmur, and Vandal was talking with Sarah, starting the way careful conversations do, to people finding neutral ground and using it to establish footing, and drifting, the way honest conversations sometimes do, into something less careful and more real. She'd asked, with the plain directness of someone who'd decided directness was the only way to ask anything. "How long have you been doing this?" "Riding." He turned his mug in his hands. "Since I was 19. The club, longer than your son's been alive. No apology in it. No inflation either. Just a fact about time. Dangerous. Sometimes." "Is this," as she gestured, taking in the garage, the men, the bikes, the whole strange afternoon, normal? Ending up somewhere you didn't plan? This exact situation? No, but unexpected. Yeah, that's normal. Roads take you where they take you." He looked at his coffee. "You learn to be ready for wherever you end up." She was quiet a moment. "Ethan's like that. He just meets whatever's in front of him. I don't know where he got it." A small pause. "His father wasn't. A lot of good things don't come from where you'd expect to find them," Vandal said. She looked at him with the particular attention of someone filing a sentence away to think about later. "No," she said. "I guess they don't." Across the garage, Ethan had the generator's pull cord in hand, watching the door, gauging whether the rain had eased enough to open it without flooding the floor. He decided it had, walked over, cracked the door to feet, a rush of cool, wet air and the smell of rain on concrete rolling in, and pulled the cord. The generator caught on the third pull, settled into a clean, correct idle. He stood and listened to it, the way he always listened to a running machine, every sense trained on the sound, checking the rhythm, the frequency, for anything that shouldn't be there. 30 seconds, a minute. He nodded once, reached down, cut it. "Good," Gunnison asked. "Good," Ethan said. To small words that landed in the room with satisfaction way out of proportion to their size. Several men had been listening to that engine without making a show of it, and the clean sound of something fixed and working right settled something warm into the room. Torres came back off his call, stood near the door with his arms crossed, expression carefully composed, holding on to something he wasn't ready to hand over yet. Vandal glanced at him once. Torres gave the smallest shake of his head. Asterisk not yet. Asterisk Vandal looked away. Ethan caught that too, filed it alongside the first exchange, and the shape the two made together was one he didn't yet have enough pieces to name, the specific discomfort of an incomplete pattern. Uncomfortable in exactly the way it always is for a mind built to find solutions. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said to Vandal. "Go ahead." The guy Torres was calling. He said it straight, because straight was the only register he trusted. "Is that about Henderson?" The room didn't go silent. It was already close to silent, but the attention in it sharpened. Vandal studied him a long moment. "Why would it be?" "Because you asked me his name 20 minutes ago." And then you looked at Torres, and Torres went to make a call. Ethan held his gaze. "I'm not complaining. I just want to know what's going on." Vandal set his mug on the bench, looked at it, then back at Ethan. "We know some people," he said. "People who know how to dig up information." "What kind?" "The kind that's public record if you know where to look. Property filings, business registrations, court documents. Things men like Henderson are very careful about on the surface, and a lot less careful about underneath." Ethan felt something move through his chest, not quite excitement, something more tangled. Excitement and dread braided together at a ratio he couldn't sort out. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "For people you just met. Because your mother made us coffee," Vandal said from the stool, brown eyes level and dead serious. "And you fixed Wicker's bike. And because a man like Henderson sounds like he's been operating too long without anybody looking back at him." "That's not much of a reason," Ethan said. Vandal held his eyes long enough that Ethan had to work to keep from looking away, which he did, because he wasn't going to flinch from the answer to his own question. "You opened your door," Vandal said finally. "You didn't know who we were. Didn't ask. Saw people who needed help and opened it anyway." "That's just basic," Ethan said. "That's rarer than you think." Vandal picked his mug back up. "And it's reason enough." The rain outside had dropped further, into that thin, persistent aftermath rain that's more idea than substance. Through the partly raised door, the light had changed. The pale, washed clean light of late afternoon after a storm, everything scrubbed and temporary, somehow more visible than before. Torres crossed to Vandal's side, spoke low, close enough that only Vandal was meant to hear. Ethan watched Vandal's face while he listened, watched the small shifts move across it, something sharpening, something settling, something close to satisfaction, but not quite arrived. The look of a man getting confirmation of a suspicion. Vandal looked at Torres. Torres nodded. Vandal looked at Ethan. "Your mother," he said. "She's got those bank records saved. Proof the payments were on time." "Yeah," Ethan swallowed. "She keeps them in a folder in the kitchen drawer. Every month for 8 months." He paused. "She was going to take them to a second lawyer next week. Someone 2 towns over. Cheaper." Vandal nodded slowly. "Tell her to hold off on that." "Why?" "Because Torres just found something that lawyer's going to want to see before she walks through the door." He held Ethan's eyes. "Henderson doesn't just do this to your family. He's been doing it for 11 years. 3 tenants before you filed complaints that went nowhere. 2 of them have signed affidavits sitting in a county clerk's office, 1 county over that nobody ever connected into a pattern, because nobody was ever looking at the whole thing at once. The silence that followed was total. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. Sarah had been standing near the interior door, close enough to hear, and Ethan watched the color shift in her face, not draining, the opposite, something coming into it that hadn't been there a minute earlier. "He's done this before," she said. 11 years, minimum, Torres said, reading off his phone. 3 properties, 2 counties. Adjusted his approach every time a case didn't go to trial, learned, got better at it. He looked up. "But the affidavits are real, they're filed, and they establish a pattern. That's a different animal from your case standing alone." Sarah pressed a hand against the door frame, just for balance, just long enough to absorb what she'd heard. Then she straightened. "How do you know how to find all this?" Torres glanced at Vandal. Vandal met her eyes with the same directness he always led with. "We've had to learn how to find things," he said, "for a long time. You learn where information lives and how to reach it when you need to. You did this in 20 minutes, she said. "Torres is fast," Vandal said, and something in his tone came about as close to light as it ever got. Ethan looked at his mother, thought about the folder in the kitchen drawer. 8 months of bank records kept with the diligence of someone who knew, deep down, she'd need them someday and didn't know how yet. He looked at Vandal, still reading the room with those steady grey-blue eyes. "What happens next?" he asked. "Next," Vandal said, "we wait for the rain to stop," which Ethan understood was not actually an answer about the rain outside. The light kept shifting toward clarity. the last of the storm siding northeast and taking the pressure with it, leaving behind the particular stillness that follows weather doing its work. Not exactly peace, but something resolved, the way a room feels after a hard conversation that finally happened. Gunnison stood, stretched his back with a sound age sometimes makes, winced, laughed at himself for wincing, and the laugh moved through the room the loose, easy way laughter does when it doesn't need a reason. Cass had fallen into low conversation with Wicker, whose hand kept drifting back to his fender as if double-checking it was still smooth. Doyle had closed his eyes on the stool, though the tilt of his head was too alert to be actual sleep. Ethan went back to the generator, secured the last casing bolts, coiled the cord, set the machine ready to carry. He'd run it over to Mr. Paulson's the moment the road was passable. He thought about the old man, the way he'd apologized 3 separate times for needing a simple repair, and felt the familiar ache of caring for someone who shouldered more worrying than he needed to. He thought about what Taurus had dug up, 3 prior tenants, 2 affidavits, a pattern nobody had ever assembled, because nobody had been looking at the whole picture at once. He thought about Vandal's parting line, the one that wasn't really about rain. He thought about what it meant to have 23 people, strangers an hour ago. Now something else, something his 16-year-old vocabulary didn't have an exact word for, but that sat in his chest with the clarity of something physical. He thought about how little he'd actually done. Opened a door, called out directions, pulled a dent, cleaned a carburetor, and how those small, true actions had somehow built all of this. He didn't fully understand it. He was honest enough with himself to admit that, but the feeling in his chest wasn't confusion. It was the feeling of a system finding its correct shape, the same feeling he got from a repair well done, something wrong working its way back to right. He picked up the generator, carried it to the door outside. The rain stopped the way it sometimes does on the plains, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had shut off a valve, and the silence afterward was so complete that several men glanced up at the same instant, orienting to a sound that had suddenly vanished after being constant long enough to become invisible. Vandal set his mug down. "Let's get the bikes out, check them over." A simple instruction, but it moved through the room, something everyone had been waiting for, and the men responded with the efficiency of a group that shares an unspoken language of movement, each man drifting to his own bike, running hands over paint and chrome with the focused tenderness of long ownership. Ethan raised the garage door fully. The air that poured in was storm-scrubbed clean, wet concrete and ozone, and the sharp green smell of trees freshly rained on, and it moved through the garage and changed its whole feel. The way open air always does to a closed space, not dramatically, just definitively, inside and outside suddenly permeable again. He stood in the doorway and looked at the road. Hail had done what hail does, popped pavement, puddles collecting in every low spot, a river of stripped leaves and debris running the gutter, torn loose from the elms with total indifference. The sky above had gone the pale, spent grey of something that had finished its argument and had nothing left to prove. A strip of lighter colour at the western edge that would be sunset in about an hour. Gunnison appeared beside him. "How's it look?" "Rideable," Ethan said. "Watch the standing water by the curb. It's deeper than it looks. The drain there's been clogged since spring. I've told the county twice," he said the last part with the resigned specificity of someone who'd gone through proper channels and gotten exactly nothing back. Gunnison glanced at the curb. "Good to know." A pause. "You taking that generator over?" "Couple minutes. Once the bikes clear out and there's room to move." Extracting 23 motorcycles from a garage packed with that much precision was the mirror image of packing them in, not chaotic, but demanding the same careful attention to angles and order, the same patience of big men maneuvering heavy machines in close quarters. Ethan guided them out with the same calm authority he'd used to bring them in, standing in the door, calling adjustments in his unhurried way, treating the whole thing as simply a spatial problem with a spatial answer. Vandal watched from the driveway, letting his men work, letting the kid work, giving him the full attention he reserved for things worth watching. It took 12 minutes. When the last bike cleared the door and the garage was his again. Empty in the way a garage feels empty after being full, somehow both bigger and smaller than before. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He walked the space checking the floor, found nothing left behind except 2 coffee mugs on the low shelf and a folded $20 bill tucked under the workbench stool that hadn't been there before. Creased with what he'd learn later were Doyle's particular fingerprints. He picked it up, held it a moment, folded it, pocketed it, and grabbed the generator. Outside, the group had gathered back on the road in a loose formation, quite ready to leave, bikes idling. Some men mounted, some still on their feet, conversation clustering here and there. The low rolling presence of Holly engines filling the street. Ethan came out with the generator and set it at the foot of the driveway, taking in the strange unreality of watching something that had lived in his garage now scowled against the ordinary street. The elms, the familiar dimensions of his neighborhood. Sarah was on the porch, changed into different clothes. Ethan noticed the quiet, private shift from work face to home face, arms crossed, not defensively, just against the post-storm chill, watching the street with an expression that had moved past fear, through relief, and settled somewhere quieter he didn't have a name for yet. Vandal came up the driveway toward her, deliberate as always, every step a legible statement. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. "We'll be out of here in a few minutes," he said. "Wanted to say this to you directly, not just through your son." A pause. "What Torres found, the affidavits, the pattern, that's yours. Take it to whatever lawyer you want, in whatever county you want. Harmon County's clerk records are public. Any attorney who knows how to pull a file can get to it." Another pause. "But there might be other ways we can help. We're not lawyers, but we know people who know things lawyers sometimes miss." Sarah looked down at him. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means Henderson's gotten away with this for 11 years, because nobody's ever laid the whole picture out in one place, in front of the right person, at the right time. That picture exists now. Torres pulled most of it together in 20 minutes. Somebody with more time and reach can finish it. And then what? And then a man who spent a decade squeezing people out of their homes answers for it. Flat, plain, no heat, no threat. The next logical step in a sequence, stated as fact. Sarah was quiet, the elm above the porch shedding slow, irregular drops. She was thinking, and the thinking showed the same way it showed in Ethan, the stillness, the absence of performance. "Why do this?" she asked, the same question her son had asked, asking for the same thing underneath it. Vandal held her eyes. "Because your son opened a door most people would have kept shut," he said. "And because it's within our power to help. Sometimes that's reason enough." She held his gaze a long moment. "I don't know how to." She stopped, started again. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." He held her eyes steadily. "Just keep those bank records somewhere in reach fast." He turned and headed back down the driveway. Ethan, standing at the bottom with the generator at his feet, had watched the whole exchange and stepped aside to let him pass. Vandal stopped beside him, shorter than Ethan remembered from inside. Or maybe Ethan was just standing straighter now. He looked at him directly, the kind of eye contact meant to make sure something landed and stayed. "You did something good today," he said. "Not because it worked out, because it was right." Ethan met his eyes. "I just did the thing that made sense. That's what courage looks like from the inside," Vandal said. "From the outside, it looks like something else entirely." He held the look another beat, gave one nod, and swung onto his bike. Ethan stood in the driveway and watched him mount it with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, body knowing the machine by memory. The engine came up, joined the rest of the street's noise, and the whole group began orienting toward departure. It was Doyle who caught him off guard. The old man had been one of the last to mount up, moving with the careful negotiation his joints required. Helmet on, engine running, when he swung his bike back around and rolled up to where Ethan stood. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and pulled out an actual card. Cardstock, edges worn soft, a phone number in heavy ink and nothing else, and held it out. Ethan took it. "That's my number," Doyle said. "Not the club line. Mine." He held Ethan's eyes with those direct brown ones. "You need anything? Not today. Not this week. Whenever. You understand what I mean by anything asterisk?" "Yes, sir." Doyle looked at him a moment longer. "Keep fixing things, son. It's what you're for." He turned the bike, rolled down the driveway, and took his place in line. Ethan stood there, card in one hand, generator at his feet, and watched 23 motorcycles pull out from the curb. They left the way they'd arrived. "To buy two," ordered, taking the road with the same easy authority. Vandal in front, at the curb with the blocked drain, the one Ethan had warned Gunnison about. The lead bike slowed and threaded the standing water clean. Then the whole line was past the elms, past the stop sign, out onto the county road, and the sound of their engines stretched and thinned into distance. And then it was gone. The street went quiet. Grover Street was always quiet after 6, but this was a different quiet, the particular stillness of a space that had just held something large. Ethan stood in it a moment, card in one hand, generator by his feet. His mother came down off the porch, crossed the yard, stood beside him without a word, both of them looking toward the end of the street where the convoy had disappeared. She put a hand on his shoulder, not gripping, not making a statement, just resting it there. The way you touch something solid when the world's just reminded you that solid things still exist. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah." He glanced at the card. "You?" "I don't know yet." A pause. "Maybe. I think maybe." She looked down the empty street. "Ethan, how did you know to wave them in like that?" He gave the question its due seriousness. "I did the math," he said. 23 bikes, golf ball hail, open road. The math said they needed cover. I had cover to give. The same honest half shrug. It was the obvious answer. She turned and looked at him. 16. Taller than her for 6 months now. And she still hadn't fully reconciled that fact with the boy she remembered rushing to the at 4 with a split forehead. The boy who'd cried at a movie about a dog, who took machines apart and put them back together better than new, who saw the world as systems with solutions. The straightest line he could find between a problem and its answer. "You're taking the generator to Mr. Paulson," she said. Not a question. "Yeah, it's done. Runs clean. Come back for dinner." "I will." She squeezed his shoulder once and went back inside. And he picked up the generator and started down the sidewalk. The hush of Grover Street settling around him, something familiar. He'd made it half a block when his phone buzzed. He shifted the generator to one arm and checked it. Unknown number, a text, 3 words, asterisk check your email, asterisk. He stopped on the sidewalk. He didn't have an email most people knew about, just the one he used for parts, orders, and the odd repair inquiry through a neighborhood app. He pulled it up, and there it was, a message from an address that was just a string of digits, no name, no subject line, an attachment, and 5 lines of text. Asterisk Henderson Properties, LLC Formation Records show a second LLC Henderson Development Group, registered in a different county 6 years ago. Both entities have shown up in eviction proceedings. State regulations bar dual entity involvement in tenant displacement when both entities profit from the same property. This isn't a grey area. Documentation attached. Keep it somewhere safe. T***. He read it twice, pocketed the phone, and stood on the sidewalk with the generator in his hand, looking at nothing in particular for 3 full breaths. Torres had been on his phone right up through the last stretch of the storm. Torres hadn't stopped when the rain did. Torres had built something and sent it forward. A message dropped into the right hands at the right moment. Ethan picked up his pace. He had something to tell his mother when he got back. Mr. Paulson opened his door on the second knock. A small man at 73. White hair overdue for a cut. Sharp, kind eyes behind thick frames. He saw the generator and his whole face changed. Relief and delight moving through him with the transparency of someone who'd either never learned to hide joy or had unlearned the habit somewhere along the way. "Ethan," he said, "in this storm, you didn't have to. Storm's over," Ethan said. "Wanted you to have it back tonight. Come in, come in." He stepped back with the eager hospitality of a man who'd been alone enough to genuinely welcome company. "You get caught in it. I watched that hail from the window. Never seen anything like it in 30 years on this street. I had some visitors," Ethan said, setting the generator just inside the door, crouching to connect the fuel line, check the switch, run one last look over the machine. 23 motorcycle riders got caught out in it. I put them all in the garage. Mr. Paulson stared. 23. Hell's Angels. The stair held. How'd they all fit? Did the geometry, Ethan said. And the small smile he almost never showed pulled at one corner of his mouth. Mr. Paulson shook his head slowly. The look of a man who just decided the world was more interesting than he'd assumed. "Pull that cord," he said, nodding at the generator. "Let me hear it." Ethan pulled the cord. It caught on the first try. Warm engine, clean fuel path, settled into an even idle, doing exactly what it was built to do. Mr. Paulson stood listening with his eyes half shut. The look of someone hearing music they'd thought was gone for good. "Beautiful," he said. Ethan killed it after 30 seconds. "Good to go," he said. "Keep water out of the fuel, and it'll run you another 10 years easy. What do I owe you?" "Nothing, Ethan, nothing," he said again, standing. "You let me watch you work that tractor 3 years running. That's worth more than one carburetor clean." Mr. Paulson looked at him with the particular expression of an old man who's learned when arguing isn't worth it. "Thank you," he said. "I mean it. I know you do." Ethan was halfway to the door when something occurred to him, and he turned back. "Mr. Paulson, you've lived on this block longer than anybody, right? Since the early 90s, 91, the old man said, puzzled by the turn. "You know Henderson, Gerald Henderson, the landlord." His expression shifted. Not dramatic, not performed, just the specific look of a man about to voice an opinion he'd been sitting on. "I know of him," he said carefully. "Tried to buy my house 8 years back. Came around 3 times. I told him no 3 times. He looked at Ethan. "Why? Anyone else on the block ever have trouble with him? Besides my mom?" The old man was quiet a moment. "The Ray's family," he said. 2014, 15, maybe. Rented the corner house, the green one, before the Marshes bought it. Left all of a sudden. Mrs. Ray's never said outright what happened, but she cried saying goodbye." He paused. "And the Holloways before them to 2011. Same story. 1 month they're there, next month gone. And he had that place listed inside 60 days. Ethan filed it. The Ray's family, the Holloways. 2 more names for the pattern Torres had already started assembling. "If I needed to reach the Ray's family," he said, "would you know how?" Mr. Paulson thought a long moment. "I might have an address somewhere. From Christmas cards. Maria Ray still sends one every year." He shuffled off toward the whole table, came back with an address scrawled on a notepad page. "A town to counties east," held it out. Ethan took it, folded it carefully, tucked it into the same pocket as the 20 in Doyle's card. "Ethan," Mr. Paulson said, and his voice shifted into that register old men sometimes reach for when they've been sitting on a question a while. "What exactly are you doing?" Ethan looked at the folded paper in his pocket. "I think I'm putting a picture together," he said. "Just need a few more pieces." He said his goodnights and headed back up the street through the post-storm evening, the air still carrying that scrubbed clean quality, his mind moving fast, not anxious, just the clean, linear churn of someone who'd found a problem and was working systematically toward its answer. He had the bank records. He had Torres's file. He had 2 names of families that had vanished suddenly from Henderson Properties. He had Doyle's card, a number and a promise. He thought about what Vandal had said, that Henderson had run this for 11 years, because nobody had ever put the whole picture together in one place and shown it to the right person at the right time. The picture was getting clearer, and Ethan Blake had always had a gift for seeing pictures other people missed. He was through the front door and into the kitchen before he'd fully decided what he was going to say. Sarah was at the stove, and she looked up, reading his face with 16 years of practiced fluency. What happened? He set his phone on the table, pulled up the email from the string of numbers, slid it toward her. Taurus sent me a file, he said. Henderson's been running to LLCs at the same time. 1-4 owning property, 1-4 developing it. Using both in the same eviction is illegal under state law. Not a grey area, Taurus says. Sarah set down her spoon. She picked up the phone, read the 5 lines twice, the same careful full attention read she gave the threatening letters, words that carried legal weight. Then she looked up. Who's Taurus? One of the riders, the one with the full sleeve. He sent you this, mostly while they were still here. Ethan sat across from her. Mom, I also talked to Mr. Paulson. He remembers the Ray's family, 2014 or 15. Same thing, sudden move out. And the Holloways, 2011. He has Maria Ray's current address. Sarah set the phone down very carefully. The way you set something down when your hands need to be free for whatever your mind's doing. She sat across from him. The stove was still on, and neither of them noticed. Ethan, she started, and stopped. I know, he said. This morning I was going to call that cheaper lawyer to town's over, she said. Because the first one said fighting would cost more than moving. She looked at the phone. And now you've got a patent document to prior tenants. And a dual LLC violation, Ethan said. It's not just your word against his ledger anymore. Now it's a system that's been running 11 years. Against evidence that proves it's been running 11 years. He held her eyes. That's different. She looked at him a long time. Her son, 16 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with an engine reader's calm and a solver certainty, and the faint tension around his eyes that told her he was more scared than he let on. That under the linear reasoning ran the same fear she carried. The same terrible knowledge of what losing this house would actually cost, in ways no dollar figure could measure. Where did these men even come from? She said. Not entirely a question. Highway 77, Ethan said, with that small smile again. Wrong time, wrong storm, right garage. She reached across and covered his hand with hers. Held it there. I'm calling the lawyer in the morning, she said. The one 2 towns over. But I'm calling him with everything. She nodded at the phone. Everything Taurus found. The Ray's address, all of it. And I need you to send me that email. Already did, he said. 10 minutes ago. She shook her head slowly, looking at him. When did you on the walk back from Mr. Paulson's? She pressed his hand harder. Eat something, she said. You need to eat. He ate. But his mind wasn't on the food. It was on the pattern, on a system that had been broken for 11 years and might, finally, be in the process of correction. He thought about Vandal's voice. Asterisk a man who's been doing what he does too long without anybody looking back at him. Asterisk. He thought about what it meant to look back. What it took to look back with enough proof in hand to make the looking count. He thought about the convoy, already miles from Millhaven by now, riding toward Eastport, or wherever the road happened to be taking them tonight. 23 men who'd ridden in out of a storm and left something behind, without ceremony, that could change everything. Later, after dinner, after Sarah had filled 3 pages of a legal pad and checked the bank records folder twice, looking, finally, less like a woman carrying something alone, Ethan went back out to the garage. He went because the garage was where he thought best. Because the storm had interrupted the Honda job and he wanted to check his own work. Because 23 motorcycles had filled this space 2 hours earlier, and now it was empty again, and he wanted to stand in that emptiness and see what it felt like. He flipped the lights on, stood in the middle of the floor, and looked around, the walls, the bench, the shelves, the swept concrete, and it was all still layered over, in his mind, with what had happened here. The tight geometry of packed bikes and packed men, the way the door had come down over a storm, and 23 people had been safe because he'd done the math and made the call. He crouched near the left wall, where the first bikes had pulled in, and found faint tire marks, the pressure print of a heavy machine turning at an angle. He touched one, real. All of it had been real. He stood, went to the bench, opened his laptop from under its cloth on the low shelf, pulled up towards his email, opened the attachment, 37 pages, formation documents, registration filings, property records, dates and entity numbers, and transaction history, all assembled with a precision that told him whoever built it wasn't new to this kind of work. He read it slowly, the way he read repair manuals, extracting what he'd need to apply. 40 minutes in, he hit the line that stopped him cold. A property transfer, 6 years old. The kind of routine filing generated by the hundreds every year in every county clerk's office, sitting in public databases, invisible until someone builds the context that makes it visible. The filing showed a transfer from Henderson Properties LLC to Henderson Development Group LLC, the property, 412 Grover Street. Ethan looked up from the screen, looked at the garage wall, looked out at the mailbox down the driveway. Their address was 414. Henderson had already moved the vacant lot next door, the one that had sat empty 2 years. The one Ethan had assumed was just an undeveloped gap between houses, into his development entity 6 years ago, which meant the plan hadn't started with their block. It had always included their block from the beginning, which meant Henderson had been patient, which meant the pressure on his mother wasn't opportunistic at all. It was the final move in a plan that had been running for 6 years, and their house was the last piece missing. He sat with that a moment. The weight of it wasn't crushing. It was clarifying, the way knowing the full extent of a problem always is, because worse is still truer, and truth is always easier to work with than uncertainty. He picked up his phone, looked at Doyle's card, 9:47 at night, either far too late to call, or exactly the right time, depending on who you asked. He thought about the old man on the stool with the direct brown eyes, who told him not to argue with a compliment, who'd left a 20 under the stall and a card with a promise attached to it. He called Dot. It rang twice. Doyle's voice, not groggy, not surprised, just present. You found something, not a question. Property transfer, Ethan said. 6 years back, he moved the lot next to us, 412 Grover, into his development entity. We're 414. He's been planning this 6 years. Doyle, what's happening to my mom isn't new. It's the last step of something long. Silence on the line. Not surprised silence. The silence of someone slotting new pieces into a structure already under construction. How far into the file are you? 40 of 37 pages. Keep reading. A pause. And Ethan, don't call the lawyer yet. Before your mother calls in the morning, you call me first. His voice was measured, certain. There's somebody we want her talking to instead. Doesn't charge by the hour. And she's been hunting for a case with exactly this shape for 2 years. Another pause. Can you trust me on that? Ethan thought about the dent tool, the $20 bill, the convoy pulling away into pale post-storm light. Thought about 23 people who'd needed a door opened, and how what came through that door hadn't stopped moving since. Yeah, he said. I trust you. Good, Doyle said. Finish the file. Get some sleep. And Ethan, you did right today. More right than you know yet. The line went quiet. Ethan set the phone down and went back to reading. The garage still and silent around him. The night outside clear after the storm. The kind of clear that sharpens the stars, and everything that was about to happen was already in motion. He read until 11:30, and when he finally shut the laptop and went in, he carried 3 certainties with him. The certainties of someone who'd just read 37 pages of public record with a mind built for pattern. First, Henderson had been running this exact strategy on Grover Street since Ethan was 10. The empty lot at 412 wasn't empty by accident. Henderson had bought the house that once stood there, demolished it after a code violation he'd engineered through a building inspector whose name showed up next to Henderson's entity filings far too often to be coincidence, and then simply sat on the cleared land while assembling the rest for properties he already controlled, and one he didn't minus for 114 Grover. The Blake house, second, the dual LLC structure tourists had flagged wasn't just a technical violation. It was the entire mechanism. Henderson Properties collected rent and managed tenants. Henderson Development held the rights and stood to profit once the land was assembled. Every time a tenant left through Henderson Properties, the property transferred to Henderson Development within 60 days. In every case Ethan could find. Same man, both roles landlord and developer, sole beneficiary of the whole cycle. The statute tourists had cited made it exactly what he'd said. Not a grey area, not a matter of interpretation, but the precise kind of violation regulatory agencies exist to pursue. Third, one name appeared 3 separate times in contexts that seemed unrelated, but pointed at the same outcome. A notary, a property assessor, a county permit clerk. 3 different people in 3 different official roles, each showing up at a critical moment in Henderson's paper trail, each appearance enabling something that shouldn't have been possible. Ethan didn't know yet what to do with that last piece, but he wrote the 3 names on paper and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Alongside the card, the 20, the Ray's address. He slept 5 hours, not because he couldn't have slept more, but because he woke at 5:45 with the specific alertness of a mind that had kept working straight through the night and arrived at morning with its conclusions ready. He called Doyle at 6. Doyle answered on the first ring. Either he'd been up already, or he slept with the phone in reach. And Ethan suspected the former, that early was simply Doyle's habit, the discipline of a man who believed the day belonged to whoever was already awake for it. You read it all, yeah. Ethan stood at the bench, the jacket with its pocket of papers hanging behind him. There's 3 names you need to hear. He read them off in order. Notary, assessor, permit clerk. Doyle listened without a word, his breathing steady, occasionally a scratch of pen on paper somewhere on his end. Where Ethan finished, Doyle said, "Give me a few hours. Who's the person you want my mother to talk to?" Valeria Ochoa, attorney, works for a non-profit, tenant rights outfit out of Lincoln. She's been building a systemic fraud case 2 years running and been missing exactly the piece she found. A pause. Won't cost your mother a dime, and she know exactly what to do with what you handed her. Ethan was quiet a moment. How do you know her? Helped her organization out about 1.5 years ago. Different situation. Same kind of problem. A developer using paperwork to push people out of homes they had every right to keep. He said it plainly. The way he said most things, describing rather than explaining. She's the real thing, Ethan. She cares. I'll tell my mom. Tell her before 9. Valeria's in her office early. Another pause. And Ethan, those 3 names. Don't put those in an email. Keep it on paper. Keep the paper somewhere you control and hand it to Valeria in person. Understood. He hung up and went inside. Sarah was already in the kitchen. Hadn't slept much either. The faint hollows under her eyes giving it away. Coffee brewed too early. The legal pad open with last night's notes, and a fresh set added in the pre-dawn hours when staying in bed had stopped being possible. He sat across from her and told her everything. The transfer, the 6-year timeline, the 3 names, the dual LLC mechanism, Valeria Ochoa. She listened without interrupting, the way she always listened to things that mattered. Whole body still, hands flat on the table, eyes on his face. When he finished, she was quiet 10 seconds, long enough for him to start wondering what she was thinking, then said, "He's been planning this since you were 10 years old. Since before we even moved here," Ethan said. "We came when I was 13. He already owned the lot next door. He was already waiting." Her jaw shifted. Not a small movement. He rented to us, knowing exactly what he'd eventually try to do. He let it run long enough to build a real record first, then started building the fake one. He watched the full weight of it settle across his mother's face, the premeditation, the years of patience from a man who decided long ago that whoever the Blakes turned out to be, they'd simply be an obstacle to clear eventually. "Mom, he did this to 3 families before us. 11 years running. We're not alone in this." She looked down at her hands a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, but her voice held steady. "Call this Valeria Ochoa," she said. "Right now." He called from the table, Sarah beside him, both leaning slightly toward the phone as if proximity would help. 4 rings. Then a woman's voice, clear and direct. "Ochoa, my name's Ethan Blake," he said. "Dale Doyle told me to call you. I've got a tenant fraud case. My mother's the tenant, and I think I've got documentation of a dual-entity eviction scheme connected to a pattern going back 11 years. A brief silence. "How old are you?" 16. Another silence, different from the first. "Dale called me last night," she said. "He told me a 16-year-old had found the piece I've been missing for 2 years. I've been waiting for your call." Her voice shifted. Not warmer exactly, more direct, which turned out to be its own kind of warmth. "Tell me about the dual-entity structure." He told her everything, in the order it had assembled itself. Tor's file, the property transfer, the 6-year timeline, the 3 names. She stopped him twice, once to confirm the transfer's exact date, once to have him repeat the permit clerk's name, and both times he answered precisely. Then she went quiet, and he could hear typing. When he finished, she said, "The permit clerk, you have the document number." He pulled it up in the laptop in 40 seconds and read it to her. More typing. "Mr. Blake," she said, and the formality of it, aimed at a 16-year-old, landed harder than he expected. The weight of being taken completely seriously, addressed as someone whose information genuinely mattered. "What you assembled overnight, between you and whoever Torres is more than I've managed in 2 years chasing this. The dual entity piece is the keystone. I've had the pattern, the timeline, the displaced tenants, but without the mechanism. I couldn't argue this was systematic fraud instead of aggressive but legal business decisions. A tap on paper somewhere. This is the mechanism." Sarah gripped Ethan's forearm across the table. He felt it, didn't look over. "What happens now?" he asked. "I file a complaint with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division today. I've got a contact there who's been waiting for a case with exactly this shape." A pause. "That doesn't make your mother safe immediately. Henderson can still push the eviction through the courts unless we get an injunction. But an active ag investigation is the landscape fast. Judge's notice." Another pause. "Can your mother come to my office tomorrow morning?" Ethan glanced at his mother, already nodding, her grip on his arm not loosening. "Yes," he said. "Bring everything, the bank records, every letter Henderson sent, the Torres file, and the paper with the 3 names. In person. Do not email the names." Her tone made clear she understood exactly why Doyle had said what he'd said. "And Ethan, you did something significant here. I want you to understand that." Her voice was level, entirely sincere. No performed encouragement in it. "This case has been missing its center for 2 years. You found it in one night." He didn't quite know how to answer that, so he said, "Thanks for picking up." "Thank Dale," she said. "He vouched for you harder than I've ever heard him vouch for anyone." The call ended. Ethan set the phone down. He and his mother sat a moment in a silence that had a different texture from every silence they'd shared across 8 months of letters and math, and that slow, narrowing feeling of a trap closing. This one had air in it. "Tomorrow," Sarah said. "Tomorrow." She stood, poured coffee she didn't need, stood with her back to him, and he understood she was taking a moment for herself, not hiding, just carving out space to feel something privately before folding it back into the shared world between them. He let her have it, and looked over the legal pad, the folder of bank records, 8 months of careful documentation that had been the only wall standing between them and the fiction Henderson had built. He thought about the woman who'd kept every page, who made $41,000 a year cleaning other people's houses, and came home and kept the records anyway. Went to a lawyer, heard the worst possible answer, came home and kept the records again. The stubbornness of it, the love that stubbornness was built from. He thought of her hand on his shoulder the night before, watching the convoy vanish. "Mom," he said. She turned. "It's going to be okay," he said. Not the hollow reassurance those words sometimes carry, but a conclusion reach through evidence. The math says so. She looked at him, pressed her lips together, and said, I know it does. She set the coffee down. I've known since last night. I just needed one night to be scared anyway. That's fair, he said. Yeah, she said, almost smiling. It is. The morning moved forward. Sarah called her supervisor, arranged to come in late. Ethan went to school, 2 tests waiting, and skipping wasn't something his mind would let him do comfortably. Disrupting a system for no functional reason simply wasn't in his nature, even when the reasons felt enormous, and he sat through his classes the way someone does when their mind is running 2 tracks at once, answering questions on the surface while underneath. The second track kept turning over what Valeria Ochoa might be filing that day, what an ag complaint would look like to a judge, what Henderson would do once he realized the ground beneath him had shifted. He didn't tell anyone at school. It wasn't a story he knew how to hand off in a hallway between classes, and the gap between his life and the lives of the people around him was something he'd grown used to, not painfully, just as a fact, the way most facts settle in. He was in his last class when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He waited for the bell, checked it in the hallway. A text from Doyle, 4 words, asterisk she filed at noon. Asterisk. He stood there with his backpack on one shoulder, students moving around him, and felt something move through him that wasn't quite any single named emotion, but held pieces of several: relief, vindication, the specific exhaustion of sustained high-stakes focus finally letting go, and underneath all of it something quieter, tied to a door opened in a hailstorm, and everything that had walked through it since. He texted back, asterisk thank you. Asterisk Doyle's reply came 40 seconds later. Asterisk you did the work. We just pointed. Asterisk he walked home the long way, down Grover Street from the south end, past the stop sign, past the curve with the blocked drain, past the elms, past the empty lot at 412. He now understood wasn't empty by accident. He stopped in front of it a while, just a rectangular stretch of overgrown ground, nothing visible about it, unless you already knew what you were looking at. He wasn't seeing it for the first time anymore. He was seeing it as year 6 of a plan, the calculated patience of a man who'd decided long ago this block was his, and the people living on it were temporary. He stood with it a while longer, then walked on home. His mother's car was in the driveway. Inside, he found her at the kitchen table, phone in front of her, wearing an expression he hadn't seen on her face in a long time. Not happiness exactly, something bigger and less comfortable. The look of someone who's been carrying an enormous weight and just been told they can set it down, except their muscles haven't figured out how to let go yet. Valeria called, she said. She filed. The AG's office confirmed receipt. She paused, hands flat on the table. She also reached out to the Reyes family. Maria Reyes called her directly, and Maria cried on the phone. Ethan cried because she's been waiting 2 years for someone to look at what happened to her and call it what it was. What else? The 3 names you found. The notary, the assessor, the clerk. 2 of them are still in their positions, which means this AG investigation isn't just about Henderson anymore. It might be about official corruption in the county. She said it carefully, still absorbing the shape of it. She said that changes the category of the case entirely. Not just tenant fraud anymore. Bigger. How much bigger? She looked at her hands. She didn't say exactly, but she said cases like this, once they hit the egg level and touch official corruption, tend to move fast. Because when people in office see something like this coming, they'd rather be on the right side of it before someone else assigns them the wrong one. Momentum, Ethan said. She called it leverage. Sarah looked up. She said we have leverage. They sat looking at each other across the table, and in the space between them lived 8 months of letters and math and fear. The morning she'd come home to find her garage full of strangers and a 16-year-old who'd waved them in. All of it still present, and layered over it now. Something else, the specific texture of a wrong finally being named and pointed at the right lever for correction. The doorbell rang. They both turned toward the front of the house. Sarah frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. And a doorbell landing in the middle of a conversation like this one carries its own particular interruption. She stood, went to the door. Ethan heard it open. Then nothing for a beat. Then his mother's voice, carefully controlled. "Can I help you?" A man's voice. Ethan didn't place it right away. The voice of someone who'd rehearsed his line and was delivering it with the smoothness of a man who'd delivered plenty like it before. "Mrs. Blake, sorry to just show up. Gerald Henderson. I wanted to speak with you personally about the lease situation. I think there's a misunderstanding we could clear up between ourselves." Without, Ethan was in the kitchen doorway before he finished the sentence. He saw a man in his mid-50s, clean collared shirt, standing on the porch with the posture of someone used to doors opening in his favor. Not big, not small, a face that was probably pleasant when it needed to be, currently set to a mode meant to look reasonable and warm, and underneath it something considerably less of both. A folder tucked under his arm. He always had a folder. Henderson's eyes drifted from Sarah to Ethan in the doorway, and something recalibrated in his expression, a quick social readjustment, the fast math of someone who'd learned to read a room. "Your son," he said, nodding at Ethan with the vague gesture of someone including a person in a conversation he wasn't ready to have. "Yes," Sarah said. She hadn't moved from the doorway, hadn't stepped aside to let him in, kept her body squarely in the frame. Not aggressive, just unmistakably clear. "What misunderstanding did you want to discuss, Mr. Henderson?" He opened the folder, the familiar papers, the ledger, the letters, and held it toward her like something reasonable. "I've got my records here showing 3 months of." "Your records are wrong," Sarah said. Henderson's expression adjusted, the manufactured warmth dialing up a notch, the way it does when someone says exactly what you expected, and you've already got a script ready. "Mrs. Blake, I understand you feel that way, and I genuinely want to work through. I have bank records for every single payment," Sarah said. "Dated, on time, exact amount from the lease. Everyone." She didn't raise her voice. She hadn't raised it once in 8 months, and she didn't now, but something in her tone had changed overnight into something harder than the careful steadiness she'd been holding on to for so long. This wasn't managed fear anymore. This was the voice of someone who knew exactly what she knew, completely. "Your ledger's wrong," she said. "I can prove it's wrong." Henderson looked at her, warmth recalibrating again. "I hear you. I understand you believe that, but legally, a property manager's record." "I spoke with an attorney this morning," Sarah said. "Her name's Valeria Ochoa. You might want to write that down." The name landed. Ethan watched Henderson's face with the same diagnostic attention he brought to a stalling engine, hunting for the thing beneath the surface, and there it was. Brief, controlled, barely there, a fractional tightening around the eyes. The face of a man hearing a name he hadn't expected and receiving information he wasn't ready for. Gone in under a second. The manufactured warmth reassembled, a little less smooth than before. "I'm not familiar with. She's with the Nebraska Tenant Rights Coalition," Sarah said. "She filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office this morning." A pause. "Regarding your business practices." Both entities. The second landing hit harder than the first. Henderson went very still. Not calm still. The stillness of something that had been moving and suddenly had to stop and take stock. His eyes cut from Sarah to Ethan and back. And in that movement was a man revising a situation he'd thought he understood, discovering the revision was serious. "I think," he said. And his voice had shed all its rehearsed smoothness for something more careful, more real, "that this may have become a bigger misunderstanding than." "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said. She stepped back from the door, not to let him in, just to put a step of distance between herself and something she no longer needed to be close to. "I'm going to Valeria Ochoa's office tomorrow morning with my documentation. I'd suggest talking to your own attorney before contacting us again." She held his eyes. "Anything else?" He stood on the porch 3 seconds that felt considerably longer, glanced at the folder in his hand like he'd only just noticed it was there, looked back at Sarah, then past her at Ethan in the doorway, and something crossed his face that wasn't pleasant and was, for once, entirely genuine, the first honest expression he'd shown since arriving. The look of a man who'd walked in expecting something simple and found the opposite waiting for him. "No," he said. "Goodbye," Sarah said, and shut the door. She stood with her back against it, hands still on the knob, and Ethan watched her shoulders rise and fall on a long, full breath, the release of someone who'd been holding something in for a long, long time, and was only now letting it go. Then she turned and looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a beat. "That was something," Ethan finally said. Sarah let out a sound halfway between a laugh and an exhale, something she'd been holding since the second she heard Henderson's voice through the door. "I've wanted to say that to him for 8 months, she said, voice shaking slightly, the good kind of shaking, the aftershock of adrenaline once the danger's passed. Not those exact words, but close. "You were perfect," Ethan said. She looked at him. "He's going to lawyer up tonight." "Yeah, and tomorrow could still be rough." "It'll be rough," Ethan agreed. "But Valeria knows what she's doing. The AG's office has the complaint, and the pattern's documented." He held her eyes steadily. "The math still says the same thing it said this morning." She crossed the space between them and did something she hadn't done since he was probably 13. Pulled him into a real hug, the kind that didn't account for the fact that he was taller now, that he was 16, that 16-year-olds sometimes carry complicated feelings about being hugged by their mothers. He didn't have complicated feelings about it. He wrapped his arms around her and held on, felt her breathing slow against his shoulder, looked past her at the closed front door and the ordinary street beyond it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Sarah pulled back, glanced at his pocket. "You should check that." He pulled it out. 3 texts. Same unknown number from the night before, Torres. He opened them in order. First, * Henderson Development filed a motion this morning to transfer the lot next door to a third entity. Looks like he caught wind of something. Second, * don't worry about it. Already flagged it for Ochoa. She was expecting it. Third, * also, tell Doyle he owes me dinner. Ethan stood there, phone in hand, read them twice, then did something he rarely did in front of his mother or anyone else, laughed. A real laugh, short and startled, the sound of someone whose sense of the world's capacity to surprise him had just gotten a top up. Sarah looked over. "What?" He showed her the phone. She read it, and her own face broke into something not quite the laugh she might have had on a different day, in a different situation, but close enough to serve. "Tell him it's a deal," she said. "You don't even know which restaurant," Ethan said. "If he can file property motions in real time off the back of a motorcycle," Sarah said, "he can pick his own restaurant." And this time, it was a real laugh, clear and short and completely genuine. The laugh of someone who'd come through something hard and was discovering, on the far side, unexpected reasons to laugh at all. Ethan typed back, * Doyle says deal. Then he pocketed the phone and looked at his mother, thinking about what the next 24 hours held. The drive to Lincoln, the sit down with Valeria Ochoa, the documentation spread across a conference table in front of someone who'd know exactly what to do with it. He thought about Maria Reyes crying on the phone because someone had finally called what happened to her by its right name. He thought about the Holloways, about the 3 prior tenants, about the building inspector whose name he'd read at 11:30 the night before in a quiet garage in Millhaven, Nebraska. He thought about a convoy of motorcycles caught in a hailstorm and the 16-year-old doing geometry. "Mom," he said. "Yeah, we should eat. You need to eat." She looked at him a long moment. Her son, the one who'd stayed calm when she was afraid, who'd stayed up half the night reading 37 pages of legal filings, who'd found the piece 2 years of professional work hadn't found, who'd done the math and told her it was on their side, and said, "You're right, I'll cook, I'll set the table," he said, and did, moving through the kitchen with the ordinary rhythm of a familiar chore, plates from the cabinet, silverware from the drawer, and the ordinariness of it wasn't small, it was the specific. grounding normalcy of a life not yet undone, in the middle of being protected, a home still a home, an evening in a kitchen on Grover Street, the table being set, dinner cooking, and outside the window, the elms stood completely still, the storm long gone, the sky over Millhaven sliding slowly, peacefully, irreversibly into dark. They drove to Lincoln before 7 the next morning, Sarah at the wheel, Ethan in the passenger seat with the bank records on his lap, and the paper with the 3 names folded inside his jacket, close to his chest, the way you keep something that matters. The drive ran about an hour 20, and they didn't fill it with talk. Both of them understood that some silences do more work than words, that riding towards something this important calls for a kind of internal bracing that conversation only interrupts. Sarah drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road. Ethan watched the flat Nebraska country slide by and ran the next few hours in his head, laying them out in the linear order his mind always used to prepare for things. Valeria Ochoa, the documents, the 3 names handed over in person. He thought about what she'd said on the phone, that the case had changed category, that official corruption shifted the landscape, that the momentum was finally running in their direction after 24 hours going the other way. He thought about Henderson on the porch, the folder under his arm, the warmth recalibrating in real time, the flash beneath the performance when Valeria's name landed. Valeria's office sat on the 3rd floor of a downtown Lincoln building with the plain, unadorned look of a place built to do work rather than announce its own importance. Her name in simple lettering on the door, which she opened before they could knock. Either she'd been watching for them or heard them in the hall, or was simply the kind of person who met things before they arrived. She was smaller than her voice had suggested on the phone, something Ethan registered and understood at once. Her voice carried the weight of what she knew, not the weight of her frame. Early 40s, dark hair pulled back, brown eyes that had spent a long time looking hard at difficult things without letting it wear her down. She looked at Sarah first, the long look of one woman taking the full measure of another. Then at Ethan. "You're the one who read the file." "Yes," Ethan said. "All 37 pages." "Yes." She held the door. "Come in." They sat at a table crowded with organized stacks of paper, to open laptops, 3 legal pads dense with angular, purposeful handwriting. Valeria sat across, glanced at the folder Sarah set down, then at the stack already waiting, the Tories file, printed, annotated in her own hand in the margins. "I've been working through what Tories put together since last night," she said. "It's good work, very good work." She looked at Ethan. "The dual entity structure is exactly what I've been chasing. I had the pattern, the acquisition timeline, the displaced tenants, but without the mechanism. I couldn't build a case for systematic fraud instead of a string of aggressive but legal decisions." She tapped the file. "This is the mechanism. And the 3 names," Ethan said, reaching into his jacket, unfolding the paper, setting it on the table. Valeria looked at it without touching it first, the look of someone who'd expected something in a specific drawer, opened it, and found it exactly where they thought it'd be. "The notary's the important one," she said. "Same notary on 3 separate documents, 3 different counties, over 8 years. That's not coincidence. And it's not legal. She's still active," Ethan said. "I know." Valeria picked up the paper carefully. "The AG's office called this morning. The investigator on the complaint, Reina Castillo. She's good. She moves fast." She looked at Sarah. "She wants to meet with you both this afternoon. Here, 2 o'clock, a pause. That's fast, Mrs. Blake. Complaints don't get assigned and scheduled inside 18 hours, unless somebody's decided it's a priority." Sarah looked at the table, then at Valeria. "Why would we be a priority?" "Because you're not the only case," Valeria said. "You're the current case. The AG's office has had 3 prior complaints about Henderson over the last decade, and none of them went anywhere, because none of them had the dual entity piece, or the official corruption angle." She set the paper down. "Now one does. And when a pattern that's been invisible turns visible all at once, it tends to create urgency in whoever's job it is to respond. Sarah pressed her palms flat on the table. The gesture Ethan had learned meant his mother was anchoring herself against a world moving faster than she'd braced for. What does this mean for the eviction proceeding? It means I filed a motion for emergency injunctive relief this morning, Valeria said, asking the court to suspend the eviction proceeding until the AG's investigation is done, a pause carrying real weight. I'll know by end of day whether it's granted. And if it's not, Sarah asked. Valeria met her eyes directly. Then we fight harder and faster. But I've got a judge I believe will grant it. And the AG filing improves those odds significantly. She picked up her pen. Let's go through your bank records. Every payment matched against his ledger, entry by entry. They worked 2 hours, slow, meticulous work that looks simple from outside and is anything but, aligning one record against another, building an airtight comparison. Ethan sat through it, followed every step, and 3 times caught a discrepancy before Valeria did, a transposed date in Henderson's ledger, an amount off by $1 in a way clearly deliberate, a payment code that matched no standard accounting convention. Each time he said so quietly, and Valeria followed his finger, made a note, and looked at him with an expression that had passed surprise and settled somewhere calmer. At one point she set her pen down and asked, "What are you going to do when you grow up?" He glanced at the ledger. "Fix things," he said. She picked the pen back up. "Yes," she said, "I can see that." At 10:10, her phone buzzed on the table. She read the screen, went still 3 seconds, the stillness of someone receiving news they'd been waiting for, processing it before it left her mouth. The injunction was granted, she said. Sarah made a sound, not a word, the sound that comes before words, the body reacting before the mind's caught up. She pressed both hands over her mouth, looked at the ceiling a moment, and Ethan sat completely still beside her. Understanding this was hers, that everything moving through her right now was 8 months of letters and math and fear, and the porch, watching 23 motorcycles disappear around the corner, all of it resolving into this ceiling, these bright eyes. No eviction proceedings can move while the egg investigation is active, Valeria said. Henderson is legally barred from taking any action against your tenancy. She set the phone down. You're not going anywhere, Mrs. Blake, not today. Not while this case is open. Sarah lowered her hands. Her voice, when it came, was entirely steady. The steadiness of someone finally allowed to stop carrying something impossibly heavy. How long will the investigation take? Cases like this, with the corruption angle, 6 to 18 months. But you're protected the whole time. Valeria looked between them. And Maria Reyes is coming in Friday. The Holloway's daughter, too. They're in Iowa now. But she called last night. Said her parents kept documentation. A pause. Henderson's been doing this 11 years. That's about to end. The 2 o'clock meeting with Reina Castillo ran 90 minutes. Castillo, late 30s, precise, unhurried. The manner of someone who'd learned thoroughness was the only kind of speed that actually saved time. She asked Ethan directly about the 3 names, the transfer at 412 Grover, the date sequence in Torres' file, the questions of someone building a structure and setting each material into place with care. When the meeting ended, she shook his hand, then his mother's, and said to Sarah, "Your son found the piece we couldn't. I want you to know that." Sarah looked at Ethan. "I know," she said. They drove home in the late afternoon light, sun behind them now, the flatland turning gold, and this time the quiet in the car carried a different weight, heavier with something good. The specific fullness of a burden, carried so long it leaves an impression on the body, even after you've set it down, so you feel lighter and marked by that lightness both at once. Sarah drove 20 miles before speaking. "We're not leaving," she said, quiet, to the road. "No," Ethan said. "We're staying." "Yeah," she breathed. "Okay, another mile." "Okay." They were back on Grover Street by 5:30. Sarah pulled into the driveway, and they sat a moment, looking at the house, the peeling paint, the leaning porch, the garden surviving on stubbornness, neither of them moving right away. Because sometimes the right thing is to sit inside a moment before letting it become the past. Ethan's phone buzzed. Doyle. How'd it go? Injunction granted, Ethan said. AG's formally investigating. We're back with Costelia in 3 weeks. A brief silence. Then Doyle, satisfaction playing in his voice, though he wasn't a man given to showing much of it. Good. Doyle, Ethan said. How'd you know Valeria was the right person? Because she spent 2 years trying to build this case, and needed a 16-year-old out of Millhaven to hand her the piece. She was missing. Dry, direct. World works that way sometimes. The peace comes from wherever it comes from. The storm, Ethan said. The storm, Doyle agreed. And a kid who knows his geometry. Sarah watched Ethan's face through the whole call, reading him the way she always did, pulling meaning out of the small shifts with 16 years of practice. When he hung up, she asked, what did he say? That the world works out sometimes in ways you don't see coming. Smart man. Yeah. Ethan looked toward the house. I need the garage a while, she nodded. She understood that about him, that the garage was where he processed, that working with his hands cleared his mind, that mechanical and emotional weren't separate wires in him, but the same one, that fixing things was simply the language he thought in. He let himself in the side door, flipped the lights, stood in the middle of the floor, and the garage was just itself again, his tools, his bench, his floor, and also everything else, layered over it, the tire marks near the left wall, the faint dent in the concrete where the milk crate had sat under Gunnison, the space where 23 motorcycles had stood in tight, precise order while a storm did what storms do outside. He crossed to the bench, picked up a neighbor's trimmer he'd been meaning to fix, a faulty switch, nothing complicated, and started working. His hands moved through the familiar motions, while his mind circled back over the last 24 hours, applying the same attention he gave any mechanical system. What caused what each cause produced. He thought about the moment he'd first seen the convoy and run the numbers. Asterisk 23 bikes. Golf ball hail. 200 yards out asterisk. The math giving him an answer, and him acting on it without hesitation, because hesitating just meant a longer path to the same place. And the cost of that delay wasn't acceptable. It had felt obvious then. It still felt obvious now. And he thought this was probably what Vandal had meant. That courage looks like something else entirely from the outside, when from the inside it's just the straightest line between a problem and the solution. He had the switch housing open, examining the contacts, when he heard it, faint at first, from the direction of the county road. That layered rolling frequency he now recognized without needing to think about it, a sound that had lodged itself in him as permanently as any misfire pattern he'd ever memorized. He set the trimmer down, crossed to the door, opened it. They were coming up Grover Street from the south, the full convoy, all 23, riding to by 2 in the same ordered formation they'd arrived and left in, the sound of them filling the street, reaching every porch and elm in the ordinary quiet of the evening. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched them come, feeling something move through him that wasn't surprise, exactly, but sat somewhere close to it. His mother came out of the house. She'd heard them too. Everyone on the block had, and stood on the porch, arms crossed the same way they'd been the evening before, watching the street, watching her son in the doorway, watching the convoy turn off the county road and roll toward the house. They parked the way they always parked, unhurried, the authority of a group that owns whatever ground it's currently standing on. Bikes pulling to the curb in practice sequence, engines dropping out one after another from the back of the line forward until only Vandal's was left. Then the street went quiet, the specific quiet that follows something very loud suddenly stopping. Vandal swung off his bike and came up the driveway without hurrying. Same black vest, same patch, same worn certainty of a man who'd been exactly himself for a long time and had no interest in being anyone else. He looked at Ethan in the doorway, then up at Sarah on the porch. We heard, he said. Doyle called you. Doyle calls me when things go right. He stopped in the middle of the driveway, looked between them. We weren't going to just ride past without a pause, without saying it to your faces. Saying what? Sarah asked from the porch. He looked up at her. That what your son did, the math, the door, the file, all of it, it matters. Not just to you. Another pause. And the pauses weren't uncertainty. They were consideration. A careful man placing words exactly where he meant them. We've been to a lot of places. Helped people. Been helped by people. Not often by a 16-year-old doing geometry in a hailstorm. He looked at Ethan. You set something in motion. For yourself. For your mother. For those other families. A beat. We wanted you to hear that from us. Ethan stood in the doorway and let it land. Took it the way Doyle had told him to take a compliment. No deflection. Mean the thank you. Thank you, he said. Behind Vandal. Gunnison came up the driveway, carrying a small cooler. The kind you bring somewhere expecting to stay a while. Behind him Torres, Wicker, Cass, and Doyle, moving with his careful joints, and his direct brown eyes, and a brown paper bag under one arm. All of them coming up the driveway with the easy certainty of people who'd already decided this was where they belonged. Brought food, Gunnison said, holding up the cooler, glancing at Sarah. If that's all right. Sarah looked at the cooler, at Gunnison, at her son in the doorway, at Vandal in the driveway, at 21 other men settling onto her property with the quiet confidence of guests, which technically they hadn't been invited to be, and she decided, in the moment, with the same linear logic her son always used, that the straightest line here was exactly the right one. That's fine, she said, arms uncrossing. Come around back. There's a table. What followed had no precise name in any social vocabulary, but everybody inside it knew exactly what it was. 23 men, a mother, and her son, in the backyard of a worn-down house on Grover Street in Millhaven, Nebraska, on the evening of a very significant day, eating out of a cooler, talking with the ease of people who'd been through something together and come out the other side still standing. The conversation wasn't deep in the way conversations pretend to be deep. It was deep the way talk gets when people are actually present with each other, when the walls come down not through sentiment, but through shared circumstance and honest time passing. Cass talked engines with Ethan, the shorthand talk of people who share a language and don't need to explain the premises. Torres sat down beside Sarah without ceremony and said, "Tell me what Costello's like. How does she run a meeting?" And Sarah, who'd braced to stay guarded, found herself telling him, because his interest was clearly real, and real interest is hard to resist. Doyle sat by Ethan at one point, ate a sandwich, said nothing for a while, not uncomfortable, just companionable, the silence of two people at ease, without words between them. Then, you know what we mostly do, when we're not riding. No, Ethan said, look out for people. He said it simply, not organized, no plan to it, just, when something's wrong, and we can make it a little less wrong, we do. He looked at his sandwich. Been doing it a long time. Most people don't see it, because of how we look. He glanced at Ethan. You saw it before you even saw us. I saw people caught in a storm, Ethan said. That's the whole point, Doyle said. Past 7. Vandal came to stand where Ethan stood near the garage, both of them watching Sarah out in the yard, laughing at something Torres had said, genuinely laughing, a sound he hadn't heard enough of in 8 months. They stood there a while in the gathering dark. I want to offer you something, Vandal said, and I want you to just hear it. No need to decide right now. Okay, Ethan said. We run a shop, not here, about 2 hours south. Outside Omaha, real facility, real equipment, commercial work. He paused. Fella who runs the mechanical side is 61. Been talking 3 years now about training someone up and never finding the right someone. He looked at Ethan. You could work weekends during school, full time, whenever you wanted it. Real pay. Ethan was quiet a moment, thinking about his workbench, the Honda generator, the Dent tool, Gunnison Softail with 112,000 miles behind it, thinking about what it might mean to work on machines that mattered. with people who understood exactly what mattered about them. I'm 16, he said. I'm aware. Vandal held his eyes steadily. Offer doesn't expire on your 17th birthday. My mom. Talk to her. A pause. I already asked if I could ask you. She said, or was your call to make? Ethan looked over at his mother, still laughing with Torres, lighter than she'd been that morning, lighter than she'd been in 8 months, and thought about what she'd said twice in the car. Asterisk, we're staying asterisk. The way you say something that's been in question far too long, and has finally been answered. I'll think about it, Ethan said. That's all I'm asking. Vandal said. Doyle came over with the brown paper bag, set it down on the workbench just inside the garage door. This is from all of us, he said, stepping back, nodding at it. Ethan picked it up. Inside was a sealed envelope. And what was inside that wasn't anything he'd have guessed, not in any version of how he'd imagined the day ending. He stood there a long moment, silent. It's a trust account, Vandal said from behind him. In your name. For school, for whatever's next. We took up a collection, matter of fact, the way he was about most things. Like this was simply a practical matter now handled. It's not a loan, not a debt. It's what you're owed for what you did. Ethan lowered the envelope, looked at the number on the statement, looked around the garage, the tools, the bench, the floor, the tire marks by the left wall where the first bikes had rolled in during the storm, and thought about the math. Asterisk 23 bikes, golf ball hail, open road, 200 yards. Asterisk he'd run the math and opened the door. That was the whole of it. He'd run the math and opened the door. I didn't do it for this, he said. We know, Doyle said. That's exactly why you get it. Ethan stood in his own doorway with the envelope in hand, looking out at his mother in the backyard, feeling something in his chest with no single name that still somehow held everything: gratitude, relief, and the strange particular weight of being seen accurately, understood not as what he appeared to be, but as what he actually was, of watching a door he'd opened come back around to him as something he couldn't have calculated and never expected. He thought about the word Vandal had used, twice now, asterisk family dot asterisk the first time he'd heard it, running it back through his mind. He'd assumed it was kindness wearing a big word, generous, not quite literal. Standing here now, trust account in hand, his mother's laugh drifting through the evening air. 23 men in his backyard who'd ridden 2 hours out of their way to come back to a street in Millhaven, Nebraska, not because they had to, but because this was simply what they did, because Doyle had said it plainly. Asterisk we look out for people asterisk. He understood the word hadn't been used loosely at all. It had been used exactly right. He looked at Vandal. Thank you, he said, and meant it fully, the way Doyle had told him to. No small retreat, no deflection from gratitude's whole weight. Vandal looked back at him. Your family now, he said, and it was precisely what it sounded like. And it was enough. Later, when the food had run out and the stories had wound down, and the evening settled into the particular ease of people who've spent themselves fully in good company and are simply present with each other now, Vandal gathered his riders with the same 2-finger whistle and single rolling hand gesture he'd used out on the county road in the storm, and they moved with the same shared, practiced rhythm, mounting up in sequence from the back of the group forward. Sarah stood on the driveway with Ethan beside her, watching them go. Vandal was last, same as he'd been first, same position, same stillness on the bike, the same grey-blue eyes finding them one more time from the end of the driveway. You need anything, he said. Anything at all. I know, Ethan said. Vandal gave one nod, turned the bike toward the street, and the engine rose, and the whole convoy pulled out in that same ordered procession, to buy two, claiming the road with the same easy authority, heading for the stop sign, the curve, the county road, and the long flat distance past it. At the curve, the lead bike slowed for the block drain, the one Ethan had warned Gunnison about, the one he'd reported to the county twice, and threaded the standing water clean, same care as the night before. Then the group was past the elms, past the stop sign, out onto the county road, the engine noise swelling once, full, then thinning into the distance, and thinning further, and gone. The street went quiet. Grover Street was always quiet after 6. And this quiet was the same quiet it always was, and something else entirely. The way a thing can look identical on the surface and be completely changed underneath. Sarah put her arm around Ethan's shoulders, and they stood together in the driveway, looking at the empty end of the street, neither one talking for a long while, neither one needing to. The envelope was still in his hand. He looked at it, the account number, the amount, the name printed plain at the top. Asterisk Ethan James Blake. Asterisk he thought about what it could buy. Not in a transactional way, counting dollars, but the forward-looking way, seeing what it made possible, what doors it opened that had been shut, what paths opened up once the math of a life shifted from bare survival into something bigger. School, a real education in the thing he was already best at, tools of professional quality, finally his own, the chance to do what he did not as the neighborhood kid fixing things for free, but as someone handed the means to build something lasting. He thought about the garage, about the door he'd opened. He folded the envelope, tucked it into his jacket alongside the 3 names, Doyle's card, the Ray's address, and looked at his mother. "We should fix the porch," he said. She looked at him. "The porch? It's been leaning since March. I've been meaning to." He nodded at the tilted structure, still doing its best. "If we're staying, we should fix it." Sarah looked at the porch, looked at her son, pressed her lips together, and said, with the plain, quiet certainty of someone who'd made it through the hardest stretch and was finally standing on solid ground of her own. "Yeah," she said, "we should fix it." They went back inside. The kitchen table still held the legal pad with its notes, the folder of bank records, the laptop with Tors's file, all of it real, all of it documented, all of it pointing the same direction, toward accountability, toward correction, toward a man named Henderson who'd run his system for 11 years and wasn't going to get an 11th. The injunction was real. The ag investigation was real. Valeria Ochoa was real. Raina Costillo was real. Maria Reyes, to counties east, crying on the phone because someone had finally called what happened to her by its true name. That was real too. And in a garage on Grover Street in Millhaven, Nebraska, the tire marks by the left wall were real, and the number on a trust account was real, and a word a man named Vandal had said twice in 2 days was real, and the door a 16-year-old boy had opened in a hailstorm, without calculating anything beyond the obvious math, was real, and everything that had walked through that door afterward was real too, and none of it was going anywhere. A boy who'd once fixed lawnmowers alone in a quiet garage had opened a door at the right moment for the right reason. Not because he was brave in any performed sense, not because he calculated a return, but because the math was clear, the need was real, and the door was his to open. So he opened it, and the world, which sometimes works exactly the way it's supposed to, walks through.